So we are continuing in the book of Ezra. And we are at chapter 4. And we'll see how far we get. Hopefully we'll get well into and mostly cover chapter 4 today. We'll see what happens. Chapter 3, we have read of the beginning of the building of the temple, the rebuilding of the temple. They've got they've got the foundation constructed, and they pause and have a great celebration over the beginning of the construction of the temple. And there's all kinds of music and loud cheering and such, and there's also some weeping, especially of the let me see, does it say the older men? People shouted with a loud voice, many priests, fathers' house. Yes, it says in verse 12 of chapter 3 specifically, weeping of the old men who had seen the first temple. It doesn't say here why they were weeping, so maybe we'll do a little bit of speculation about that, at least in the context of this reading. If we look over in the book of Haggai, there is a statement there about from the prophet Haggai about the temple being the new temple that being built is perhaps not as grand and glorious as the original temple. Perhaps that's why these older men are weeping. Perhaps it's tears of sadness and distress over the fact that, yes, they're building the temple back, but it's not as good as it was in the past. In this context, in the context here of chapter 3, it doesn't say that that's why they are weeping, but perhaps that was the case. Some have suggested maybe these were tears of joy. There was certainly a lot of celebration taking place here, and tears of joy. Perhaps, I'm not sure why the older men particularly would be weeping tears of joy. It does say specifically that it was the older ones who are weeping in the midst of this rejoicing. It was apparently quite a celebration. It was loud, lots of noise, and it could be heard from some distance away. We have experienced things like that ourselves, perhaps. I refer to UK football games, and you can hear the shout of joy go up when UK scores a touchdown, perhaps. But it was kind of like that, very, very loud and celebratory. Okay, now, chapter 4, verse 1. Let's read a few lines here in chapter 4, verse 1. Now, when the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the people of the exile were building a temple to the Lord God of Israel. By the way, when it says the Lord here, I'm reading from the New American Standard Version. Other modern versions will use the expression the Lord here. Understand that that is probably, most likely, from the original Hebrew. It is not the generic term the Lord, but it is more specifically the name that the Lord gave to himself, and that is in sort of anglicized, we would say Jehovah. If you're reading from the American Standard as opposed to the New American Standard, you will see that the American Standard uses the name Jehovah. Wherever it appears in the Hebrew, it's going to be Jehovah, which is like sort of a direct rendering of what the Hebrew says. At some time in the past, I'm not entirely sure why, it became traditional in our English translations to render it, instead of the name Jehovah, or Yahweh, if you prefer, which is perhaps closer to the Hebrew than the anglicized Jehovah is. But it became traditional sometime in the past when it says Jehovah in the Hebrew, it's rendered the Lord in the English translation. And so you'll see that in many English translations. I think it may be helpful to notice this at this point because of the people that are going to be encountered here, and to understand their point of view and what they have to say, and what the Jews, how they respond to them. Okay. Now, when the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the people of the exile were building a temple to, and let's say Jehovah, building a temple to Jehovah, God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel and the heads of the fathers' households and said to them, "Let us build with you, for we, like you, seek your God, and we have been sacrificing to him since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us up here." These are the people that were already there in the greater Jerusalem area, in Judea, and had already been living there. Who were they, and what are they asking for here on this occasion? Do you know who these people were? What we might call them now. We being people who know and have read the New Testament. The Samaritans. If you look in the New Testament, the Samaritans are referred to occasionally. We know especially the woman at the well, where Jesus met the woman at the well as he was traveling through and passing through Samaria. And did you see the well when you went to? Not that well, okay. The well, known as Jacob's well, the well is one of the few sites in the Bible lands that is pretty certain that we know this is exactly it. That well is still in existence. I think a big shrine has been built over top of it. And Jesus met there as he was traveling through and talked with the Samaritan woman. And the Samaritan woman asked him a question in their conversation. He said, "Where should we worship?" Said, "The Samaritans say we worship here. The Jews say you should worship in Jerusalem." But as she perceived that Jesus was a prophet, as she said. And Jesus said, "Well, the Jews are right in this regard. God expects the worship under the law of Moses at the temple." He didn't elaborate on here. He says the Jews are right. Jerusalem is the place to worship. Okay, so who are the Samaritans? What was their notion? Where does their understanding of what God wanted and all of that? And what was the nature of their worship, that they would have worshiped Jehovah, the God of the Jews? What do you know about the Samaritans? These people that we're reading off here were like sort of the ancestors, the proto-Samaritans, the ancestors of the Samaritans of Jesus' day. We're talking now about 500 years, approximately 500 years before the time of Jesus. But their descendants came to be the ones that we know in the New Testament as the Samaritans. Okay. If you turn over to the book of 2 Kings, chapter 17, you will learn who these people are and how they came to know of Jehovah. 2 Kings chapter 17, and we'll start reading in verse 24. We have to go back to the time before the Babylonian captivity. The kingdom of Judah was still a distinct entity. The kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, had been taken captive by the Assyrians, the first of the captivities that we read of in the Old Testament. This was approximately 200 years before the time of the book of Ezra. Okay, the Assyrians had risen to be the great empire, the superpower of that era, and the Assyrians had taken the northern kingdom captive. The Assyrians were a bit different from the Persians in the way they dealt with their captives. We've read about here in the book of Ezra about Cyrus, the great king or emperor, we might say, of the Persian Empire, who has supplanted both the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and the Persians are now the great superpower at the time of the book of Ezra. Okay, the Persians were somewhat different. Cyrus certainly was, in that what did Cyrus do with the Jews that they had taken captive? We're reading all about it here in the book of Ezra. He issued that proclamation in chapter 1 of the Jews. It's like you can go home to your homeland, to your original homeland. You can reestablish your culture there in your homeland and rebuild your temple and reestablish the worship of your God, Jehovah, if you would choose to do that. And Cyrus said they could do that. That is not at all what the Assyrians did. What did the Assyrians do? The Assyrians took the people that they had conquered and scattered them to the four winds as best they could. They would send them to some other place in chains, and they would be scattered about. You hear about, we use this term sometimes, the lost 10 tribes of Israel. Well, it's not like they kind of disappeared and nobody knew what happened to them. What happened to them was the Assyrians had scattered them about among other lands and other people. And what did they do then with the territory that the Israelites had occupied? They're doing this same thing with everybody they conquered. They're sending them down to other places. They sent other people of other nations into the territory of the Israelites, into what we might call Palestine. That's the Roman name for this territory. They didn't call it Palestine back then, but into Palestine, they sent other people from other areas of other nations that they had captured. And as they're busy scattering everybody all around, they sent others in to live here in Samaria. Okay. These were pagan people that had been also captured by the Assyrians, that had been sent there by the Assyrians. Okay, so let's look then in 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 24. And the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon and from Cutha and from Ava and from Hamath and Sepharvaim and settled them in the cities of Samaria in place of the sons of Israel. So they possessed Samaria and lived in its cities. By the way, I suppose the Assyrian thought here was that if you can break the people up and scatter them about, it's going to be much harder for them to reconstitute their own nations, and they'll be less able then to rebel against the Assyrians because they're all going to be scattered about in different places. Verse 25, and it came about at the beginning of their living there that they did not fear the Lord. They did, that is, the Lord. Who's the Lord? The Lord is specifically Jehovah, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They did not fear Jehovah. Therefore, Jehovah sent lions among them, which killed some of them. So they spoke to the king of Assyria, saying, the nations whom you have carried away into exile in the cities of Samaria do not know the custom of the God of the land. So he has sent lions among them, and behold, they kill them, because they do not know the custom of the God of the land. Well, that is not entirely incorrect, is it? In fact, the God of that land had sent lions among them to kill them. By the way, did you see a lot of lions in Israel? They are largely, they're not extinct, but like so many other animals, especially large predatory animals, their territory has shrunk. There was a species of lion called the Asian lion. It's like the African lions. They look very much the same, but about 3/4 size. They're a bit smaller. And they were not uncommon in this territory at that time. You go over there now and you don't see lions out in the wild, but they were there at that time. And so, and they're referred to in various places in the Old Testament. And so God has sent lions among them. Now, so that was not incorrect. What is incorrect is like who this God is. This God is the true and living God, the creator of the universe, the only God that really exists. Other gods exist, but only in the imaginations of men, right? That's where they exist. Other gods are false gods and don't actually exist. So the Assyrian view is this: we sent these people into this territory. Oh, there's a problem here. These people from these other lands that we brought into Samaria, they don't know and worship the God of this particular territory. You see the pagan polytheistic notion of who God is here. There's a God in this city, and there's a God in that city. There's a God of the mountains. If you go on the other side of the mountains, there's another different God over there, and there are lots of gods, and it's a very small understanding of God and who God is. God is not the one true existing one who created the universe, but gods are these little, some kind of supernatural beings of some sort that each has their own territory. So if you go to where the Samaritans, to the land of Samaria, you'd better get in touch with that God there, because he's the God that you're going to need to worship if you're going to be there. Because if you're going to be there in his territory and you're not worshiping him the way he wants you to worship him, then you're going to have trouble. That's where the lions came from. This seems to be the understanding of the Assyrians. Okay, verse 27 of 2 Kings chapter 17, then the king of Assyria commanded, saying, he's got the solution. He said, take there one of the priests whom you carried away into exile. That would be one of the Israelite priests, and let him go and live there, and let him teach them the custom of the God of the land. So one of the priests whom they had carried away into exile from Samaria came and lived at Bethel, and taught them how they should fear the Lord, that is, Jehovah. To the Assyrians, one God of many gods. Who's the God of the Israelites who lived here in this? Oh, there's the Baals, and there's Ashtaroth, and there's Molech, and all of these different gods, Dagon. But here, there's the God Jehovah lives here, and he's the God here. And so go get one of the priests of that God. You took them captive, go get one of them and bring him back, and let him teach these people about this God that's in this place. Okay, that is who the Samaritans were. This is how the Samaritans, the Samaritans of the time of Jesus were the descendants of these people. So did they know of the true and living God? The answer is, well, sort of. but their concept of God was he was one God of many, and they probably learned from this priest. He's not named here, but this priest, they learned something of the worship of Jehovah. My guess, I'm guessing here, my guess is they learned some things sort of a superficial ceremonial nature. Oh, look, here are certain sacrifices that we do. Here are certain festivals, certain feasts that we keep. Here's how we would worship in our temple, and here's what the priest would do and stuff like that. But they seem not to have really gotten the understanding of the true and living creator God that is the only God that actually exists. Okay, so we come down a couple of hundred years later to the time of Ezra, and that's who the people are here that we're reading about in Ezra chapter 4, that the people of Ezra's day are confronting as the Jews return to Jerusalem to start rebuilding the temple. There are these other Samaritan people there. Do they know about God? Let me see. I'm back to Ezra chapter 4, verse 3. Then they approached Zerubbabel and the heads of fathers' households, and they said to them, "Let us build with you. For we, like you, seek," notice how it says this, "we, like you, seek your God." Notice they're not saying we seek the God, the only true and living God, but we like you, we seek your God. Yeah, we know about Jehovah. We learned about him. Yeah, we'll worship him too. We'll join with you in worshiping him. Let us build with you, for we, like you, seek your God. And we have been sacrificing to him since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us up here. We just read about that in 2 Kings when that happened. Okay, they've got an offer for help building the temple. What is the response of Zerubbabel to that offer? We want to help you. Hey guys, we're going to worship your God too. Let us join with you and help you. We'll just be all one big happy family here. But Zerubbabel and Jeshua and the rest of the heads, Jeshua was the high priest, and the rest of the heads of fathers' households of Israel said to them, "You have nothing in common with us in building a house to our God, but we ourselves will together build to the Lord God of Israel as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us." It's like, thanks, but no thanks. We don't want you to have a part of this. We are going to rebuild the temple. We are going to worship God. We are not going to join with you in this regard. Can you see why good men of faith in the true and living God would not want to join with these people, would not want to accept this offer? Why not? Say what? They're polytheistic. They are polytheistic. These are pagan worshipers. Did they know something of Jehovah? Yeah, in a way, but their understanding of him was a pagan polytheistic kind of understanding of who God was. He's one God among many. And so what will happen? Do your own surmising here based on your own knowledge of the scripture, based on your own knowledge of warnings in the scripture to the Israelites, and based on what you see in your own day in your own life. What would happen if the worshipers, the faithful worshipers of the true and living God form an alliance with these polytheistic pagan worshipers who thought they knew something about God? What would happen? They would be led away, right? Who would be led away? The worshipers of true and living God the tendency is they will be led away by the worshipers of the false gods who have a very flawed understanding of who God is. That is the tendency. You see warnings of it over and over again throughout the scriptures. What about the Israelites when they were moving into the land of Canaan? What were they to do with the people who lived there? Okay, they weren't supposed to marry them. They were to hand emotions here. They were to get rid of them, weren't they? To drive them out. It seems, we read about this and it seems quite brutal to us in many ways in our modern, we are so sensitive to these things. In our modern sensibility, it seems quite brutal how they would go in and conquer a city and kill everybody. They were to get rid of the occupants of that land. They were not to intermarry with them. Well, by the way, is that a kind of racial bigotry that's taking place there? Is it like you don't marry them and you don't interact with them, you get rid of all of them? Is it because we don't like them because their skin is not the right color or something like that? No, it's not that, is it? It's because they will lead you away from the true and living God. For all of his wisdom, I think Solomon is an interesting character. Would you like to have Solomon's wisdom? Solomon had wisdom specifically from God, given to him directly from God. He was a very wise man in his ruling. But I'll tell you, and that was known, that was widely known. The Queen of Sheba, who came from wherever Sheba was to come see him, had heard about him and had heard about his wisdom and wanted to come and see for herself. And so she did. And Solomon was a very wise ruler. As wise as Solomon was, he did some foolish things. And one of the foolish things that he did is he married 700 wives and he had 300 concubines, and many of them were women of the nations around them that were not faithful worshipers of God, and they pulled him away. That's what happens. That's the tendency. You think, well, I'm going to go here and I'm going to associate with these people, and look what a great evangelistic opportunity that will be for me. Well, maybe it will be. I'm not saying it wouldn't. Whatever associations you may have with other people. Okay, but we must be careful and we must be warned of God, because it's throughout the Old Testament and it's right here in Ezra chapter 4, that the tendency is going to be, if you form alliances with the world, be careful about that. You can't serve two masters. You can't serve both the true and living God and also serve the world. And so you need to be very careful about this. And I'm thinking about us and our own life and our own dealings. There are people all around us that would be delighted to come and join us. It's like, oh, we are all Christians. We are all worshiping the same God. Or maybe we're not even Christians, but look, maybe we're good conservative Jews, or maybe we are. I'm not religious, but I'm very spiritual. Have you heard that? I've heard that a lot lately. I'm not religious, but I'm very spiritual. So let's just all join together. Unity in the faith is a good thing, but let's be careful about who we unite with. Mike?
Your question is racial, it's racist. I think anytime you have two groups of people with different cultures and different ideas coming together, the tendency for them to affect each other. It's not just one, they both.
Yes.
And if you have a situation like, maybe I'm remembering it wrong, but I'm thinking like when the Normans invaded England, the people there spoke Old English, and the Normans spoke Northern French. And pretty soon everybody's speaking Middle English, because you got these two languages now being spoken together, and they start changing each other.
Yeah.
But who cares? It doesn't matter what language you speak. So in general, this isn't a bad thing. It's just, we go from one neutral thing to another thing. But one of the things is people who worship God, and yet there's people who don't, meeting in the middle, completely destroy.
It's drawing you away from God. It reminds me of the old joke about somebody reaches into your pocket and takes your money. Takes your $10 in your pocket, out of your pocket. You say, hey, you just stole my money. You stole my $10. And the guy says, no, that's my money. You say, no, it's not. You got it out of my pocket. And he says, okay, let's compromise. Compromise is a good thing, right? Let's compromise. I'll give you 5 back and I'll keep 5 and everything will be fine. That's what happens when you start compromising, isn't it? It's like if you are a worshiper and faithful, a worshiper of the true and living God and faithful to him, and you come together with others who are not, and you become like each other, what is that doing to your faith in the true and living God? It is drawing you away from him. You're going in the wrong direction. Okay, so I think this is what Zerubbabel and Jeshua here are thinking about when they say, no, we're not going to join with you. We're not going to let you join with us in rebuilding the temple to the Lord. These people already had a history of they're pagans, they're polytheistic, they are not worshipers of the true God. Really, they know of him, and they may be in some ways engaging in some kinds of going through some motions of worship to him, but they don't have any understanding. Eddie?
It's interesting to look at the language. So Zerubbabel's commenting with this, you have nothing in common with us. That's the definition of fellowship. And yet when you look in 2 Kings 27, you pointed out, it says they fear the Lord and they also fear their God.
Yeah.
Their service to their God. So from a man's perspective, you say, well, they do have something in common. They both fear the Lord. But Zerubbabel said, no, if you fear the Lord and then you have nothing in common with us.
Okay, yeah.
And that shows that fearing of the Lord must be exclusive. If it's not exclusive, then we cannot have fellowship with it.
Okay, yes, good point. Anyway, where are we? Verse 4, then the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and frightened them from building. What we see the Jews' response to this offer. What's the response to the response? We have offered to come and help you, and you have turned us down. Now what? Is it okay, fine, that's cool. We'll leave you alone. Is that the response? That's not the response. The response is the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and frightened them from building. Let's go on to verse 5. And hired counselors against them to frustrate their counsel all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. It's like, you won't let us be part of what you're doing. We're going to oppose then what you're doing. And so it said they hired counselors. To put it in modern lingo, they took them to court over it. I don't know how closely their legal system would correspond to ours, maybe not very closely, but hiring counselors here seems to be, to frustrate them, seems to be sort of like what we would call they sued them. They are using what means they have now to try to interfere. You're not going to let us participate. We're not going to let you do it then. We're going to interfere with what you're doing. And so they use whatever tools they have at their disposal to do that. Okay, so this was not a momentary thing, by the way. This wasn't just like, well, they filed a lawsuit and maybe it was dismissed or something like that, and then they were done. This is ongoing throughout the reign of Cyrus, all the way up to the reign of Darius. Cyrus was he was not actually the first Persian king. He was the first Persian king of the great Persian Empire. It was largely Cyrus that made Persia into the great empire it became. There were actually, in lesser Persia, before Cyrus, there were some other Persian kings, but we'll pick up with Cyrus here, who is like, I think I said the other day, he was the first Persian king. He wasn't literally the first, but the first of the great Persian Empire. Okay, Cyrus was king for about 9 years. That's a 9, trust me. Cyrus was king for about 9 years. Then there was Cambyses. It was actually Cambyses II. There was another one back before Cyrus by that same name, who was about 8 years king. And then there was, I'll have to look. There was Gomates, who was only king for about a year. He didn't last very long. And then there was Darius, known as Darius the First. There were other Dariuses after him, and he was about 35 years. Okay, so if this gives you some sense of how much time we're talking about here, it was during the time of Cyrus that this is taking place, and they continued to fuss and fight over this with the Jews down until the time of Darius. Now we're going to get to Darius very shortly here in the book of Ezra, and there's very little said here other than this verse here in chapter 4. There's very little said about what's going on here. By the way, these are the names that would have been used by the Greek historians through whom we know about some of this from secular history. Okay, remember we have this problem sometimes of a king might be known by various names, and we may have various kings known by the same name, and sometimes it's a little hard to know who we're talking about. Okay, so here, we're reading from the book of Ezra, verse 6 of Ezra chapter 2, now in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem, Ahasuerus or something like that. It is believed by many that that's this guy, Cambyses, Ahasuerus, known by that name. And in the days of Artaxerxes, Bishlam, Mithridath, Tabeel, and the rest of his colleagues wrote to Artaxerxes, king of Persia, and the text of the letter was written in Aramaic and translated from Aramaic. And so it is believed by many that this is this one. Okay, there is some uncertainty about some of this. You don't find universal agreement on just quite who the players are here. Some would say about some scholars of the Old Testament, whoever they may be, would say that actually Ezra here is referring to, is more thematic than he is chronological, And he's referring actually to some things that took place after Darius, and Ahasuerus and Xerxes, Artaxerxes here, or perhaps those who are known by those same names after Darius. I'm not going to try to resolve all of the disagreements over that and interpretations here. The way it is presented in this narrative, we go from Cyrus to Darius, and there were some others in between, and there are others in between here that referred to by in the book of the Ezra referred to by these names, Ahasuerus and Artaxerxes. Okay, so that's kind of where we are. So as they have these Samaritans, as they have hired their counselors, they are apparently, they've written to, we know they've written to Artaxerxes here because we've got the text of the message comes next in chapter 4. And so we've got the text of that message. Apparently, they also had written to Ahasuerus, who was perhaps this king before. So this is an ongoing, they are constantly causing trouble here and trying to prevent the Jews from getting the job done of rebuilding the temple. What effect did that have on the Jews? They were, yes, I have to go back to verse 4, then the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and frightened from building. Okay, so they were frightened from building, and the building actually ground to a halt. Well, that was our first bill. So if we start in verse 8 and read down to the end of chapter 4, we're going to read more about what caused the rebuilding of the temple to actually come to a complete halt here. Okay, so they were discouraged from building. They were frightened by the people around them. Remember, this was not a large number of people that came back. This was, I mean, as we're thinking of populations of lands and cities, it was about 50,000 that came back, and they no doubt did not have a great army to fight against the people around them if they were a mind to do that. Anyway, they were frightened of what was going on, and that opposition that they met was effective because they brought the construction of the temple to a halt here. Okay, let me mention this. In chapter 4, starting in verse 8, something happens here in the text that we can't see in our English translation. And that is up to this point, up through chapter 4, verse 7, this is all written in Hebrew. Starting in verse 8, it switches to Aramaic in the original text. Okay. Aramaic was the language of the Assyrians. It was the language of a lot of people in this part of the world. And with the Assyrian conquest and the Assyrian scattering of people all over, that scattered the Aramaic language all over. And we see the beginning here of the dominance of the Aramaic language in this part of the world. And so they wrote this letter here in Aramaic, and it says, verse 7, the days of Artaxerxes, so on, wrote to Artaxerxes, king of Persia, and the text of the letter was written in Aramaic and translated from Aramaic, probably translated to the Persian language for the Persian king to read. And so starting in verse 8, it goes on in Aramaic down through verse 18 of chapter 6. It's in Aramaic. Just an interesting little sidelight. I'm not sure what that means to us at this point. We don't see that, of course, in the English translation of it. Okay. So anyway, they write this letter to Artaxerxes, and so I guess we'll have to leave it here. We've got a couple of minutes left, so we, meaning you, will pick up here, I presume, next Sunday. And I'm pointing over here to Kevin, and Kevin will be teaching starting next Sunday. It's come to that time of come to that time of the year when I'm going to have to be in Nashville. And so my responsibilities of my job there in Nashville actually begin on Thursday of this week, and I will be back to my usual commuting schedule. I don't know if you've noticed this, but I kind of come and go when school is in session. And I may actually be here next Sunday, but I think it's time for Kevin to take the reins here of this class. And when I'm here, will continue in the study of Ezra under Kevin's leadership. And if you've been in Kevin's classes before, I know many, if not most of you have been, you know Kevin will do a good job with this. And I look forward to the Sundays I can be back and study with you in the book of Ezra. Okay, Ezra chapter 4, verse 8, picking up with the Aramaic there in the book of Ezra.